During World War II, the world was engulfed in flames. Millions were fighting, dying, and suffering under the iron fist of conflict. But for thousands of German soldiers, their war ended in a way they could never have foreseen. It didn't end on the blood-soaked fields of Europe or the frigid Eastern Front. It ended here. In a land untouched by destruction, a land of silence, forests, and endless wilderness, this is Canada. Imagine being a young German soldier, captured in the heat of battle in North Africa or the shores of France. You're shipped across the treacherous Atlantic, expecting the worst. You've been told stories of brutal enemy camps, starvation, and revenge. You brace yourself for a living nightmare. But when you arrive, the reality is so profoundly different, it feels like a dream. Instead of barbed wire fortresses in a desolate wasteland, you see vast, shimmering lakes. Instead of angry, vengeful guards, you are met with a surprising politeness. Instead of starvation rations, you're given warm meals, often better than what you ate as a soldier. This was the shocking reality for over 34,000 German prisoners of war held in Canada. This is the story of the enemy within our gates. But it's not a story of hate or conflict. It's a story of unexpected humanity, strange friendships, and the transformative power of the Canadian wilderness. So why Canada? Why ship tens of thousands of enemy combatants halfway across the world? The answer lies with Britain. By 1940, Britain was bursting at the seams with prisoners of war and was under the constant threat of a German invasion. If Germany invaded, all those captured soldiers on British soil could potentially be freed and rearmed, creating a massive internal threat. Winston Churchill looked to the dominions of the Commonwealth for help, and Canada answered the call. 26 major POW camps were established across the country, many in remote, isolated locations from Alberta to Ontario to Quebec. The logic was simple. The sheer vastness of the Canadian landscape was a prison in itself. Escape seemed impossible. Where would you go? The camps were often nestled deep in the boreal forest, miles from the nearest town, surrounded by unforgiving terrain. For these German soldiers, many of whom came from densely populated European cities, the scale of the wilderness was mind-boggling. They felt like tiny specks on an endless map. One of the largest camps was in Lethbridge, Alberta. Another, Camp 30 in Bowmanville, Ontario, held some of the highest-ranking German officers. But perhaps the most fascinating was the network of camps along the northern shore of Lake Superior. Here, prisoners weren't just confined behind fences, they were put to work. Under the rules of the Geneva Convention, enlisted men could be made to work for their captors, as long as the work wasn't directly related to the war effort. Canada had a lot of work that needed doing. The country was a powerhouse of resources for the Allied war effort, and with so many Canadian men overseas, there was a severe labor shortage, especially in the logging and farming industries. So these German POWs, many of whom had never held an axe, were sent into the forests to become lumberjacks. They cut pulpwood that was essential for producing paper and other materials. They worked alongside civilian Canadian foremen, and a strange sort of routine developed. They'd work in the bush during the day, supervised by just a handful of guards, and return to their camps at night. What they found in the Canadian bush was not the brutal forced labor they might have expected. They were paid for their work a small stipend of 50 cents a day, which they could use to buy things like chocolate, tobacco, and magazines at the camp canteen. The food was plentiful. The physical work and the fresh, clean air was healthy. For many, it was a far cry from the horrors of the battlefield. They were getting stronger, healthier, and in a bizarre twist, they were experiencing a kind of freedom they never thought possible as prisoners. The relationship between the prisoners and their Canadian guards was often surprisingly relaxed. There were rules, of course, but the atmosphere was rarely hostile. Guards and prisoners would sometimes share cigarettes, trade stories, and even learn a little of each other's language. In many lumber camps, the guards were older veterans from World War I, and they held a soldier's respect for other soldiers, even the enemy. They understood that these young Germans were just following orders, much like they had done a generation before. This isn't to say camp life was a holiday. It was still a prison. Homesickness was a constant gnawing ache. The men missed their families, their sweethearts, their homeland. They worried constantly about what was happening back in Germany, as news of devastating bombing raids trickled in. And there was a rigid hierarchy within the prisoners themselves. Devout Nazis often clashed with those who were anti-Nazi, or simply apathetic to the cause. This created internal tensions, kangaroo courts, and sometimes even violence. The most infamous incident occurred at Camp 132 in Medicine Hat, Alberta, where a group of fanatical Nazis murdered a fellow prisoner they suspected of being an informant. It was a brutal reminder that even in the quiet Canadian wilderness, the shadows of the war were long and dark. But for every story of internal strife, there are dozens of stories of ingenuity and adaptation. The prisoners were bored, and they found incredible ways to fill the time. They formed orchestras and theater groups, staging elaborate productions with handmade costumes and sets. They took university-level courses offered through the YMCA, studying everything from engineering to philosophy. They built intricate models, painted beautiful landscapes, and tended to gardens. In one camp, they even built a stunningly detailed model of the Bismarck battleship. They turned their confinement into a hotbed of culture and education, and then there were the escapes. The idea of escaping into the vast Canadian wilderness was daunting, but that didn't stop some from trying. The most famous escape artist was a U-boat captain named Franz von Wera. His story is so incredible it was actually made into a movie called The One That Got Away. After being captured and sent to a camp on Lake Superior, von Wera made a daring escape. He jumped from a moving train and through incredible grit and luck made his way south, crossing the frozen St. Lawrence River into the then-neutral United States. He eventually made it back to Germany, the only German POW to successfully escape from Canada and return home during the war. Most other escape attempts were less successful and almost comical. One group of prisoners tried to build a kayak to paddle down the St. Lawrence, hoping to be picked up by a German U-boat. They were caught before they even hit the water. Another prisoner simply walked out of his lumber camp in northern Ontario, believing he could walk to the United States. He was found a few days later, hungry, covered in mosquito bites, and utterly defeated by the unforgiving Canadian bush. The wilderness itself was the best guard. When the war finally ended in 1945, the story didn't stop. Repatriation was a slow process. The prisoners had to wait sometimes for more than a year to be sent home. They watched newsreels showing the utter devastation of their homeland and learned the full, horrifying truth of the Nazi regime's atrocities. For many, it was a period of profound disillusionment and shame. They had fought for a cause they now understood to be monstrous. They returned to a Germany that was broken and unrecognizable. And as they tried to rebuild their lives in the rubble, many found their minds drifting back to the quiet lakes and vast forests of Canada. They remembered the kindness of a guard, the taste of a warm meal, the clean scent of pine in the air. For them, Canada was no longer the enemy. It was a place of unexpected safety and humanity during the darkest time in their lives. And here's the most remarkable part of the story. After the war, thousands of these former German prisoners of war chose to return to Canada. They applied through official immigration channels and came back to the country that had held them captive. They came back to the logging towns, the farmlands, and the cities. They became Canadian citizens. They married, raised families, and built new lives. The logger who was once a prisoner cutting trees in northern Ontario came back and started his own lumber business. The farmhand from Alberta came back and bought his own farm. These men, who had arrived as enemies, became our neighbors. Their story is a powerful testament to the idea that humanity can be found in the most unlikely of places. It's a reminder that even in the midst of global conflict, individual acts of decency and a respect for shared humanity can plant the seeds of future peace. It's a complex, little-known chapter of Canadian history, proving that a nation's strength isn't just measured by its victories in battle, but also by its compassion in peace. It's the story of how the enemy came to Canada, and in the quiet of the wilderness, found a new home. Imagine you're a young soldier, barely 20 years old. You've spent months, maybe years, fighting in the chaos of World War II. Your world has been nothing but explosions, hunger, and the constant fear of death. Then, you're captured. You're put on a ship, expecting the worst. Between 1940 and 1945, this was the reality for over 38,000 German POWs who were shipped across the vast Atlantic Ocean to Canada. As they disembarked, the first thing that struck them wasn't the sight of armed guards or foreboding prisons, but the sound, or rather, the lack of it. It was silence. A profound, deep silence. No bombs whistling overhead, no anti-aircraft guns firing, no collapsing buildings. Just the rustle of leaves and the whisper of the wind. They saw pristine landscapes, endless forests stretching to the horizon. In their diaries, some wrote that it felt like they had reached the very end of the world, a peaceful, terrifyingly empty end. As they stepped onto Canadian soil, another shock awaited them: the guards. The German soldiers were braced for hostility, for shouted commands and rough handling. Instead, they were met with something utterly bewildering: politeness. The Canadian guards would say things like, "Good morning," or "Please, follow this way." They'd ask, "Do you need some water?" This wasn't the enemy they had been taught to expect. POWs were confused, disoriented. Was this a trick? A strange form of psychological warfare? One prisoner wrote in his journal, a sentiment echoed by many others: "They treated us like humans, not like enemies." This simple act of dignity, of recognizing their shared humanity, was more disarming than any weapon. It was the first crack in the hardened shell of war they had built around themselves. It was a sign that their time in Canada would be unlike anything they could have ever imagined. Their new homes were prison camps, scattered across the vast Canadian wilderness. But even these defied their expectations. The men were taken to barracks, simple wooden structures behind barbed wire fences. Inside, they found beds with actual blankets. There was access to clean water, and they were issued warm clothing to protect against the Canadian cold. The camps had kitchens that served 3 full meals a day, real, substantial meals. The contrast with the starvation and scarcity of the front lines was staggering. The German POWs, who had braced themselves for harsh, punitive conditions, found a level of decency that was almost surreal. There's a story of a Canadian officer who, seeing the well-fed prisoners, joked with them, "Don't eat more than the guards. You'll make us look bad." This lightheartedness, this undercurrent of mutual respect, helped establish a routine that was structured but not oppressive. Life in the camps, while confined, was defined by order and a surprising degree of normalcy. But what truly kept the prisoners in place wasn't the barbed wire or the watchtowers. It was the wilderness itself. Most of these camps weren't fortified like European fortresses. They didn't need to be. The real prison walls were made of trees, mountains, and rivers. The nearest town could be 100, even 150 kilometers away, a grueling trek through dense, untamed forest. This was a landscape filled with challenges the European soldiers had never encountered: formidable black bears, packs of wolves, and freezing cold rivers that could kill a man in minutes. The sheer scale of the Canadian wilderness was an impassable barrier. As one German soldier aptly put it in his writings, escape was impossible. Nature was the guard. This immense, beautiful, and dangerous landscape was a more effective warden than any human could ever be. It was a silent, ever-present reminder of their isolation and their complete dependence on the structure of the camp. With escape being a near impossibility, the men had to find ways to pass the time, and they did, with remarkable creativity and industry. The camp authorities, following the Geneva Conventions, encouraged the POWs to work. Many were sent to labor projects, primarily in logging and farming. They cut timber in the vast forests and helped harvest crops on local farms. For this work, they were paid. It wasn't much, just a small daily wage, but it gave them a sense of purpose and a way to earn currency they could use in the camp canteens. But beyond the required labor, they built their own societies inside the wire. They established theaters, putting on surprisingly elaborate plays and musical performances. They formed orchestras and choirs, their music echoing through the remote wilderness. They organized sports leagues, with fierce rivalries in soccer and hockey. They even ran their own universities. This is one of the most fascinating aspects of the Canadian POW camps. The prisoners, many of whom had their education interrupted by the war, set up their own schools, with a large number of academics, engineers, and skilled professionals among them. They offered courses ranging from high school subjects to university-level studies in languages, mathematics, and engineering. They created textbooks from memory, held lectures, and conducted exams. For thousands of these young men, the prison camp became an unexpected place of learning and self-improvement. They entered as soldiers, and for some, they had the chance to leave as scholars, with qualifications that would help them rebuild their lives after the war. This focus on education and culture turned the camps from mere places of confinement into vibrant, self-sustaining communities, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Over the years spent in these remote camps, something remarkable began to happen. The lines between captor and captive started to blur. The German POWs worked alongside Canadian civilians in the forests and on the farms. They interacted with the guards not as enemies, but as fellow men, enduring a shared, strange experience in the middle of nowhere. Friendships formed. Some prisoners were even invited into the homes of local Canadian families for holidays, sharing a meal far from the battlefields of Europe. These personal connections transformed their perception of the enemy. They saw Canadians not as a faceless opponent, but as individuals, farmers, loggers, guards with families and lives of their own. This human connection had a profound and lasting impact. Many POWs later recalled their time in Canada, not with bitterness, but with a sense of gratitude and even fondness. When the war finally ended in 1945, the journey home began. But for many, leaving Canada was a bittersweet experience. They had spent years in this vast, quiet land, and it had changed them. After returning to a devastated Germany, the contrast was jarring. They came back to ruined cities and a society struggling to rebuild from the ashes. The peace and order they had known in the Canadian camps stood in stark opposition to the chaos of post-war Europe. The memories of their time as prisoners were so powerful that after they rebuilt their lives, thousands of former German POWs made a surprising choice. They decided to immigrate to Canada. They brought their families and started new lives in the country that had once held them captive. They became Canadian citizens, contributing to the nation's growth and becoming part of its multicultural fabric. These men, who had arrived as enemies, chose to return as friends. A powerful legacy of Canada's unconventional approach to prisoners of war. Their story is a powerful reminder that even in the darkest of times, humanity and dignity can build bridges where war has created divides. Thanks for watching, and if you found this story as fascinating as I did, don't forget to like and subscribe for more hidden histories. Have you ever wondered what happens to enemy soldiers after they're captured in war? We often imagine grim, barbed wire prisons. But during World War II, for thousands of German prisoners of war sent to Canada, their experience was something no one expected. It was a story of surprising freedom, unexpected kindness, and a strange temporary home in the vast Canadian wilderness. This wasn't just imprisonment. For many, it was a bizarre and life-altering chapter that would challenge everything they thought they knew about their enemies. Imagine being a soldier, fighting a brutal war, only to be captured and shipped across the Atlantic Ocean. You expect the worst? When you arrive in Canada, instead of a cramped, miserable cell, you find yourself in a camp surrounded by breathtaking lakes, towering forests, and wide-open skies. This was the reality for over 34,000 German POWs. The camps, often set up in remote national parks like Banff and Jasper, were more like rustic villages than high-security prisons. One of the most stunning revelations for these men was the degree of freedom they were given. Within the camp boundaries, they could walk around freely. Barbed wire was often minimal. Some camps even allowed prisoners to leave for supervised work projects. This wasn't the harsh, punitive life they had been braced for. Instead, they found themselves with time on their hands and a stunning natural playground at their doorstep. They played football on makeshift fields, swam in the crystal-clear lakes on hot summer days, and tended to small gardens where they grew vegetables. They played chess, read books from the camp library, and simply breathed in the fresh, clean air. One captured officer, Friedrich, later wrote in his diary, "For the first time in years, we felt alive again. The constant fear was gone." Here there was only the sound of the wind in the pines. This unexpected liberty was the first crack in their rigid wartime mindset. But the surprises didn't stop there. Canada was facing a massive labor shortage. With so many of its own young men fighting overseas, farms and industries were desperate for workers. The government came up with a radical solution: allow the German POWs to work for wages. This was a huge shock to the prisoners. They went from being enemy combatants to paid laborers. Suddenly, they were felling trees in timber camps, harvesting potatoes on sprawling farms, building small rural roads, and loading cargo onto railway cars. They were contributing to the Canadian economy, the very country they had been fighting against. Canadian farmers were initially wary, but they were quickly won over by the Germans' famous discipline and work ethic. Many were astonished. One farmer from southern Alberta was quoted as saying, "They worked harder than some of our local boys. You told them to do a job, and they just did it." No complaints. The prisoners were paid a small weekly wage, usually around 50 cents a day. It wasn't much, but it gave them a sense of dignity and purpose. With their earnings, some managed to save money, hoping to send it home to their families after the war. Others used it to buy small comforts from the camp canteen: a bar of chocolate, fresh bar of soap, or postcards to write letters that might never be sent. This work program did more than just fill a labor gap. It built a strange, unprecedented bridge between the prisoners and the local Canadian population. Perhaps the most profound shock for the POWs was the way they were treated by ordinary Canadians. They were officially the enemy. They represented a regime responsible for immense suffering, yet day after day, they encountered small, unexpected acts of humanity. Many prisoners later wrote about these moments in their memoirs. Farmer quietly handing them crisp, ripe apples from his orchard at the end of a long workday. School children, filled with curiosity rather than hate, waving at their trucks as they drove to the work sites. A farm wife bringing out a steaming pot of tea for the men on a cold afternoon. These gestures might seem small, but to the prisoners, they were monumental. They had been indoctrinated to see the Allies as ruthless and cruel. Instead, they found compassion. They were not treated as monsters, but as men. This simple human decency, offered by their supposed enemies, began to unravel years of propaganda. It forced them to question the narratives they had been fed about the world and their place in it. For many, this was the beginning of a profound internal transformation, a denazification process that happened not through lectures or re-education, but through kindness. The camps themselves became incredible hubs of culture, art, and education. With so much time and a population full of skilled individuals, engineers, teachers, artists, musicians, the prisoners didn't just sit idle, they organized. Credibly, they formed full orchestras, with instruments often purchased with camp funds, or even built by hand. The hauntingly beautiful sounds of Beethoven and Mozart would drift through the Canadian wilderness. A surreal soundtrack to this strange chapter of their lives. They established schools inside the camps, where prisoners taught each other everything from English and mathematics to engineering and philosophy. They set up woodworking shops, creating intricate furniture and beautiful carvings. They staged theater shows, performing classic German plays to an audience of their fellow captives. They formed choir groups, organized lecture series, and even published their own camp newspapers, complete with articles, poetry, and illustrations. One camp guard famously remarked that the place felt more like a university campus than a prison. These activities weren't just a way to pass the time. They were a way to reclaim their humanity, to nurture their minds and spirits in the face of captivity. They painted stunning landscapes of the Canadian Rockies, capturing the beauty of the land that held them prisoner. Through art and education, they created a world of their own behind the wire. As the war ended and the time for repatriation came, a strange feeling settled over many of the prisoners. They were finally going home, but for some, Canada had become more than just a place of imprisonment. It was a place of transformation. They had arrived as soldiers of the Third Reich and were leaving as different men. They had experienced a freedom and kindness they never expected. The story doesn't end there. In a testament to their experience after the war, thousands of these former German POWs chose to immigrate back to Canada. They had seen a different way of life, and they wanted it for themselves and their families. They became Canadian citizens, contributing to the country that had once held them captive. Their story is a powerful reminder that even in the darkest of times, bridges can be built, and humanity can be found in the most unexpected of places. It's a little-known part of history that shows how kindness can be a more powerful force than conflict. Did you know that during World War II, the most fearsome guard for some German prisoners of war wasn't a soldier, but the Canadian winter itself? Over 40,000 German soldiers were held in camps across Canada, from the dense forests of Ontario to the vast prairies of Alberta. Many of these men had fought in the deserts of North Africa or the rolling hills of Europe. They were completely unprepared for what awaited them. Imagine stepping off a train into a world of white, where the air itself feels sharp enough to cut you. The winter of 1942 was particularly brutal, the temperatures plunging to -30, even -40 degrees Celsius. For soldiers accustomed to more temperate climates, this was like being transported to another planet. Their standard-issue greatcoats, which seemed so substantial back in Europe, felt like little more than thin blankets against the relentless Canadian cold. The initial shock was immense. One prisoner later wrote in his memoirs about his first morning in a camp in northern Ontario. He woke up to find the water in his wash basin frozen solid. When he looked out the window, he saw a landscape so buried in snow that the fences of the camp were barely visible. It was a beautiful but terrifying sight. He described the silence as something physical, a heavy blanket of quiet, broken only by the crunch of boots on snow and the distant crack of a frozen tree branch. The Canadians, both the guards and the local civilians, were well acquainted with these conditions. They watched with a mixture of amusement and pity as the German prisoners struggled. POWs had to learn a whole new set of survival skills, and fast. The most critical of these was learning how to stay warm. Their days became structured around this single vital task. They were taught how to properly swing an axe, not just to chop wood, but to do it efficiently, creating a steady supply of fuel for the pot-bellied stoves that were the heart of each barrack. They learned the art of layering clothing, something many of us take for granted today. They discovered that several thin layers were far warmer than one thick one. They learned how to move through snow that was often waist-deep, a physically demanding task that required a specific shuffling gait to conserve energy. This wasn't just about comfort. It was about survival. Frostbite was a constant and serious threat. Camp doctors, both Canadian and German, were kept busy treating men who had underestimated the cold's brutal power. One POW wrote a letter home stating, "The cold made us respect Canada more than any guard ever could." It was a force of nature that commanded absolute obedience. But the Canadian wilderness offered more than just bone-chilling cold. It was also teeming with life, and this led to some truly unforgettable encounters for the prisoners. Many of the camps were located in remote, forested areas, meaning the POS were sharing their new home with Canada's native wildlife. Work details, often involving logging or clearing land, took the men deep into the woods, far from the relative safety of the camp fences. It was here that they came face to face with animals they had only ever read about in books. Wolves were a common sight, or rather, a common sound. Their howls would echo through the frozen night air, a hauntingly beautiful sound that filled the men with a mix of awe and fear. Seeing them was rarer, but it happened. A flash of gray fur moving silently between the trees, a pair of yellow eyes watching from a distance. These encounters served as a stark reminder of just how wild their surroundings were. But it was the bears that made the biggest impression. Imagine being a young soldier from a German city. It's now to cut timber in a Canadian forest, and suddenly looking up to see a massive black bear just a few dozen yards away. These encounters were frequent enough to become part of camp folklore. While the bears were generally more interested in foraging for food than in confronting a group of men, their sheer size and power were intimidating. There was a running joke among the prisoners. One of them famously quipped in a letter, "Even if we managed to escape the camp, the bears would probably just catch us and send us right back." In a strange way, the wildlife became another layer of their confinement, a natural barrier more effective than any barbed wire. These experiences, however, were not entirely negative. They connected the men to the land in a profound way, giving them stories they would tell for the rest of their lives. This combination of extreme cold, hard labor, and wildlife encounters created a very peculiar psychological state for the prisoners. They were captives, thousands of miles from home, yet in many ways they experienced a sense of freedom they had never known. During the day, they were prisoners of war, subject to the rules and routines of the camp. But when the sun went down and the northern lights began to dance across the sky, something shifted. The long, dark winter nights were strangely peaceful. Huddled around the warmth of the stove, the men would talk. They'd share stories of home, of their families, of the lives they had left behind. They'd listen to the howl of the wolves, not with fear, but with a sense of wonder. The aurora borealis, a phenomenon most had never seen, was a particular source of fascination. They would stand outside in the freezing cold, bundled in all their layers, just to watch the curtains of green and purple light shimmer and sway across the heavens. It was a spectacle that transcended their circumstances. In these moments, they weren't soldiers or prisoners. They were just men, small figures under a vast and magnificent sky. One prisoner captured this feeling perfectly in his journal. He wrote, "In the eyes of the Geneva Convention, we were prisoners. But out here, under the stars, with the forest sleeping around us, we were prisoners only on paper. In our hearts, we felt free in the Canadian wilderness. This wasn't an escape from reality, but an embrace of a different one. The raw, untamed nature of Canada offered them a mental and spiritual escape that the camp guards could never take away. The physical hardship of the winter forged a unique bond between them, a camaraderie born from shared struggle. They learned to rely on each other to look out for one another against the common enemy of the cold. The landscape, while harsh and unforgiving, was also undeniably beautiful and pure. It was a world away from the battlefields and destruction they had come from. This experience left an indelible mark on these men. When the war ended and they were finally repatriated to a shattered Germany, many carried with them a deep and abiding respect for Canada. They had arrived as enemies, but they left with a unique connection to the land that had held them captive. Some even chose to return years later, immigrating to Canada with their families to build new lives. They came back to the vast forests and the cold, clear lakes, no longer as prisoners, but as citizens. They had been captured by Canada, but in the end, they were also captivated by it. Thanks so much for watching. It's a side of history we don't often hear about. But it's a powerful story of resilience and the unexpected ways we connect with the world around us. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the forgotten corners of history. We'll see you in the next one. When the news of Germany's defeat finally reached the POW camps scattered across Canada, you might expect a wave of relief, a collective sigh from men eager to go home. But for many, the reality was far more complicated. The joy of the war being over was quickly overshadowed by a gnawing, terrifying uncertainty. Imagine being thousands of miles from home, a prisoner, and learning that your country has been utterly defeated. The letters from home, if they came at all, were often weeks or months old. The newsreels and radio broadcasts painted a grim picture. Cities flattened, infrastructure destroyed, a nation in chaos. For these men, the end of the war wasn't a celebration. It was the beginning of a profound dread. They gathered in small, hushed groups, trying to piece together what was happening. Was their town still standing? Was their family alive? The questions hung heavy in the air, unanswered and terrifying. Many of these prisoners were just young men, barely out of their teens, who had been swept up in the war. Now, they were faced with the prospect of returning not to the Germany they remembered, but to a landscape of ruins and ghosts. The safety and relative stability of the Canadian camps with their regular meals, work, and structured life suddenly felt like a fragile bubble. As one veteran later recalled, the dominant feeling wasn't happiness, but a deep, cold fear. They had survived the war, but what would they find waiting for them in the ruins of their homeland? It was a strange and bitter irony. For some, the thought began to creep in, a whispered admission among friends. Maybe we are safer here in Canada than we will be back in Germany. This wasn't a rejection of their home, but a stark acknowledgement of the unknown horrors that might await them. The war had ended, but their personal struggle was just beginning. As the days turned into weeks and the logistics of repatriation began, a strange transformation occurred in many of the camps. The rigid lines between captor and captive started to blur, replaced by a shared humanity. For years, Canadian guards and German prisoners had coexisted in a structured, often tense environment. They had worked together on farms and in lumber camps, played soccer against each other, and lived side by side in the vast Canadian wilderness. An unspoken, often reluctant bond had formed. The guards were no longer just faceless authority figures, and the prisoners were no longer just the enemy. They were individuals, young men far from home, caught on opposite sides of a global conflict. When the day of departure finally arrived, the scenes at the train stations and ports were deeply moving and completely unexpected. These weren't the cold, formal transfers of prisoners you might see in a movie. Instead, there were handshakes that lingered, promises to write, and even open tears. Men who had once been enemies embraced, clapping each other on the back. Personal addresses were scribbled on scraps of paper, exchanged with a promise to stay in touch, a promise many would keep for decades to come. One Canadian guard, watching a train pull away with men he had guarded for years, put it simply, they arrived as enemies. They are leaving as young men we came to know, and in a way, to care for. It was a testament to the fact that even in the midst of war, human connection can find a way to grow. For the German POWs, these goodbyes were another layer of complexity. They were leaving behind not just a place of captivity, but a place where they had been treated with a degree of dignity, where they had formed unexpected friendships. They were leaving the quiet certainty of Canada for the terrifying uncertainty of post-war Germany. The journey home was long and arduous. Packed onto ships, the men crossed the Atlantic, their minds racing with a mix of hope and trepidation. But nothing could have prepared them for the reality of what they found. The Germany they returned to was a nightmare. The newsreels hadn't lied. Cities like Hamburg, Dresden, and Berlin were vast landscapes of rubble, skeletal buildings reaching towards a gray sky. Familiar streets were gone, replaced by mountains of debris. The smell of dust and decay was everywhere. This was the stunned null, the 0 hour a nation that had to be rebuilt from absolutely nothing. For a returning POW, the first task was a desperate one: find your family. This often meant a journey on foot or by clinging to overcrowded, dilapidated trains, traveling through a shattered country. Some were lucky, finding their loved ones alive, huddled in basements, or sharing cramped quarters with other families. But for countless others, the search ended in heartbreak. They would arrive at the address of their family home, only to find a crater in the ground. Neighbors would shrug, not knowing what happened, or deliver the devastating news that their family had been killed in a bombing raid or had fled and disappeared. The emotional toll was immense. After years of dreaming of a joyful reunion, they were met with silence and loss. Beyond the personal tragedy, the practical challenges of survival were staggering. There was no work. Factories were destroyed, businesses were gone. The currency was worthless. Food was scarcer than it had been in the POW camps. Men who had received 3 meals a day in Canada now found themselves standing in bread lines, gaunt and hungry in their own country. The psychological shock was profound. One former POW wrote in his journal, "In Canada, we worked hard, but we were fed. We were prisoners, but we were safe. Coming back to Germany feels like I have woken up from a dream and stepped into a nightmare." The order and predictability of camp life, which they had once resented, now seemed like a lost paradise compared to the chaos and desperation of their homeland. For many of these men, the memories of Canada became a strange and bittersweet anchor in their shattered lives. They remembered the vast open spaces, the crisp, clean air of the wilderness, and the simple decency they were often shown. These were men who had been sent to fight for a monstrous ideology. But in captivity, many had been given a different perspective. They had worked alongside Canadian farmers, shared stories with their guards, and learned about a different way of life. This experience fundamentally changed them. As they struggled to rebuild their lives from the rubble, these memories of a different world, a world not defined by war and hatred, gave them a glimmer of something to hold on to. Years later, as Germany slowly rose from the ashes and became a prosperous democratic nation, the stories of these POS began to emerge. Many of them kept the promise they made at the train stations. Letters crossed the Atlantic for decades, updating old guards on their new lives, their families, their jobs in the new Germany. Some even made the long journey back to Canada, not as prisoners, but as visitors, seeking out the places of their captivity and reconnecting with the people they had known. These reunions were powerful moments, a closing of a circle that had begun in war and ended in friendship. The story of the German POWs in Canada is a remarkable chapter of the Second World War. It's a story about how, even in the darkest of times, bridges can be built, how enemies can see the humanity in one another, and how an experience meant to be a punishment could for many become an unexpected and life-altering lesson in peace and dignity. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more hidden histories like this one. We'd love to have you as part of our community. I'll see you in the next one. Have you ever heard of an enemy who fell in love with the land of their captors? It sounds like a Hollywood movie, but this is a true, forgotten story from World War II. Imagine this. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers, captured in the heat of battle, are shipped across the Atlantic, their destination, Canada. They arrive expecting the worst: harsh guards, brutal conditions, a living nightmare. But what they found was something entirely different, something that would change their lives forever. When the first German prisoners of war, or POWs, landed on Canadian soil, they were met not with hostility, but with something surprisingly Canadian. Instead of anger and resentment, they were greeted with a sense of order and, believe it or not, politeness. The guards weren't monsters. They were often veterans of the First World War, men who understood the grim reality of being a soldier. They treated the prisoners with a firm but fair hand, a level of humanity that was completely unexpected. These weren't just any prison camps. They were set up in some of the most remote and beautiful parts of Canada. From the rugged landscapes of Alberta to the vast forests of northern Ontario and Quebec, the POWs found themselves surrounded by a breathtaking wilderness they'd only ever read about. The camps themselves were built to international standards. The men received proper food, often better than what civilians were eating in war-torn Europe. They had access to health care, mail from home, and even educational programs. Think about the sheer shock of it. One day you're fighting in the desert of North Africa, the next you're in a camp in the Canadian Rockies, taking university courses by correspondence. The Canadian government, in a remarkable act of foresight, partnered with organizations like the YMCA to provide books, sports, equipment, and musical instruments. The goal wasn't just to contain these men, but to keep them occupied, and perhaps to re-educate them away from the Nazi ideology they'd been fed. Camps became miniature communities. The prisoners organized their own orchestras, theater groups, and sports leagues. They published camp newspapers and created intricate works of art. This wasn't just about passing the time. It was about reclaiming a sense of identity and purpose in a world that had been turned upside down. They were prisoners, yes, but they were also allowed to be human. But the most transformative experience wasn't inside the camp walls. Canada was facing a severe labor shortage because so many of its own men were overseas fighting. So, a bold program was launched. POAs were offered the chance to work. They could volunteer to work on farms, in logging camps, and in pulp mills across the country. This is where the real story begins. Thousands of prisoners signed up. They were paid a small wage for their labor, and more importantly, they stepped out of the barbed wire enclosures and into the heart of Canadian society. They worked side by side with Canadian farmers, loggers, and factory workers. At first, there was suspicion. These were the enemy, after all. Local communities were wary. But day after day, working together, something incredible happened. The barriers of language and uniform began to fade. The German prisoners weren't the faceless villains of propaganda posters. They were young men, just like their own sons and brothers. They were hardworking, skilled, and often just lonely kids far from home. Canadian families would invite the prisoners into their homes for a meal. The POWs, in turn, were stunned by this kindness. They saw a different way of life, a world away from the rigid hierarchy and brutal conflict they had known. They weren't just prisoners anymore. They were neighbors. The wilderness itself had a profound effect. For men who grew up in the cities and towns of Germany, the sheer scale of the Canadian landscape was awe-inspiring. They worked deep in the forests, cutting timber under the vast northern sky. They learned to fish in pristine lakes and rivers. They felt the bite of the Canadian winter and the warmth of a summer afternoon on the prairies. This connection to the land, this raw and untamed nature, began to heal something inside them. It was a powerful antidote to the horrors of war. One former POW later wrote about his time in a logging camp, saying he felt freer in the Canadian woods than he ever did as a soldier in the German army. He was a prisoner, but he had found a kind of freedom he never knew existed. This sentiment was echoed by thousands. They called their time in Canada the Golden Cage. It was captivity, but it was a captivity that opened their eyes to a new world. When the war finally ended in 1945, it was time to go home. The prisoners were repatriated to a Germany that was in ruins, a country shattered by defeat and divided by occupation. They returned to their families, but they were not the same men who had left. They carried with them memories of a different place, a land of vast forests, open skies, and unexpected kindness. And they couldn't forget it. The experience had left an indelible mark. As soon as it was possible, something truly astonishing began to happen. Thousands of these former German POWs started applying to return to Canada. This time not as prisoners, but as immigrants. They wanted to make a new life in the country that had once been their prison. Canada's government, remembering their work ethic and the relationships they had built, accepted many of them. They came back to the very regions where they had been held. Former prisoners became Canadian citizens. They became farmers on the prairies, carpenters in Ontario, and engineers in Quebec. They brought their skills and their gratitude, contributing to the growth of post-war Canada. Some even married Canadian women they had met while working. Others settled down in towns near the old camp locations, becoming respected members of the community. Imagine the scene. A man who once wore the uniform of the German army, now running a local business. His children playing in a Canadian schoolyard. It's a powerful testament to the possibility of reconciliation. Today, the physical remnants of those POW camps are almost all gone. The wooden barracks have rotted away, and nature has reclaimed the land. But the story remains passed down in the families of those former prisoners and the communities that welcome them. It's a story of how simple human decency can triumph, even in the darkest of times. It's a story about the unique character of Canada country that, faced with its enemies, chose kindness over cruelty, and in doing so, won their hearts completely. This wasn't a planned strategy. It was just how Canadians were, a quiet, unassuming politeness, combined with the power of the vast northern wilderness, transformed enemies into friends and prisoners into proud new Canadians. This is the forgotten chapter of World War II, a tale of how friendship blossomed in the most unlikely of places. It reminds us that even in the midst of global conflict, individual acts of kindness can change the course of thousands of lives. Thank you for watching. If you found this story as incredible as we did, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more hidden histories. We'll see you next time.